Our purpose this evening is educational, to learn more about the history of Bermuda, a truly terrible history of slavery and segregation which has ramifications for contemporary Bermuda. This evening is also designed to celebrate the fact that the University of Oxford, for the first time, will be housing a collection of books focusing on the history of Bermuda. The idea for this project was born out of a lecture I attended in May of this year, hosted by the Oxford University Campaign for Racial Equality and Diversity, entitled, "Why is my curriculum so white?" Bermuda bears witness to a host of inequities. Of course, Bermuda is not alone in this regard, but we hope this evening proves at least to be a small step in promoting understanding in Bermuda and for undermining asymmetries in information. We also hope that this is the first of an ongoing series of annual lectures hosted by the Bermuda, Oxford and Cambridge Society, and also serve as a springboard for activities at the University of Oxford to focus on issues of race and resistance in Bermuda and the Caribbean more widely. Copies of the books going to Oxford are displayed at the table at the front and are also available for purchase at Brown & Co. Not all of the books remain in print. We are therefore very grateful to the family of the late Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson, who have kindly donated 2 of his books, and they'll bring them to the table now. Thank you. Before I hand over to our chair, Evelyn James Barnett, who's the Director of Communications at Bermuda College, Treasure Tannock will now read from the history of Mary Prince.
I was born at Brackish Pond in Bermuda, on a farm belonging to Mr. Charles Miners. My mother was a household slave, and my father, whose name was Prince, was a sawyer belonging to Mr. Trimmingham, a shipbuilder at Crow Lane. When I was an infant, old Mr. Miners died, and there was a division of the slaves and other property among the family. I was bought along with my mother by old Captain Darrell and given to his grandchild, little Miss Betsy Williams. Captain Williams, Mr. Darrell's son-in-law, was master of a vessel which traded to several places in America and the West Indies, and he was seldom home for long. Miss Williams was a kind-hearted, good woman, and she treated all her slaves well. She only had one daughter, Miss Betsy, from whom I was purchased and who was about my own age. I was made quite a pet of by Miss Betsy and loved her very much. She used to lead me around by the hand, calling me her little nigger. This was the happiest period of my life. I was too young to understand rightly my conditions as a slave, and too thoughtless and full of spirits to look forward to the days of toil and sorrow. I wish I could find the words to tell you all what I then felt and suffered. The great God above alone knows the thoughts of a poor slave's heart and the bitter pains which follow the separations of these. All that we love taken away from us. Oh, how sad it is. And sore to be born. I got no sleep that night for thinking of the morrow, and dear Miss Betsy was scarcely less distressed. The black morning at length came. It too came too soon for my mother and us. Our mother, weeping as she went, called me away with the other children, Hannah and Dinah, and we took the road that led to Hambletown, which we reached around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We followed my mother to the marketplace, where she placed us in a row against a large house with our backs against the wall and our arms folded across our breasts. I, as the oldest, stood first. Hannah next to me, then Dinah, and our mother stood next to us, crying. My heart throbbed with grief and terror so violently that I pressed my hands quite tightly across my breast, but I could not keep them still. I continued to leap as though it would burst out of my body. But who cared for that? Did not one of the many bystanders who were looking at us care? Think of the pain that wrung the hearts of the Negro women and her young ones? No, no. They were not all bad, I dare say, but slavery hardens white people's hearts towards the blacks, and many of them were not slow to make their remarks upon us aloud, without regard to our grief. Though their light words felt like cayenne on the fresh wounds of our hearts. I am often much vexed, and I feel great sorrow when I hear some of the people in this country say that the slaves do not need better usage and do not want to be free. They believe the foreign people who deceive them and say that slaves are happy? I say not so. How can slaves be happy when they have been haltered around their necks and whipped upon their backs and are disgraced and thought no more of than beasts, and are separated from their mothers and husbands and children and sisters, just as cattle are sold and separated? Is it happiness for a driver in the field to take down his wife or sister or child and strip them and whip them in such a disgraceful manner? Women have been stripped and exposed in the field for shame. There is no modesty or decency shown by the owner of his slaves. Men and women and children are exposed alike. Since I have been here, I am often wondered how English people can go out into the West Indies and act in such a beastly manner. But when they go into the West Indies, they forget God and all feeling of shame. I think, since they can see me and do such things, they tie us up like hogs, moor them like cattle, and lick them so as hogs or cattle or horses never were flogged. And yet they come home and say, and make some good people believe that slaves do not want to be out of slavery. But they put a cloak around the truth. It is not so. All slaves want to be free. To be free is very sweet. I have been a slave myself. I know what slaves feel. I can tell by myself what other slaves feel, and by what they have told me. The man that says that slaves are quite happy in slavery, that they do not want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. I have never heard a slave say so. I have never heard a Buckra man say so, till I heard it in England. Such people ought to be ashamed of themselves. They can't do without slaves, they say. What's the reason they can't do without slaves as well as in England? No slaves here, no whips, no stocks, no punishment except for the wicked people. They hire servants in England, and if they do not like them, they send them away. They can't lick them. Let them work ever so hard in England. They are far better off than slaves. If they get a bad master, they give warning and they go to hire another. They have their liberty. That's just what we want. We don't mind hard work if we had proper treatment and proper wages like English servants and proper time given in the week for us to keep from breaking the Sabbath. But they won't give it. They will have their work. Work, work, night and day, sick or well, till we are quite done up. And we must not speak up nor look amiss, however much we be abused. And then, when we are quite done up, who cares for us more than for a lame horse? This is slavery. I tell it to let English people know the truth, and I hope they will never leave off or pray to God and call aloud to the great King of England till all the poor blacks be given free and slavery done up forevermore. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone, by the way. Tonight's forum, I dare say, will be an intriguing one. It is unique at the very least in that it has brought together various authors and their varying perspectives of the issue of race and resistance in Bermuda's most recent past. But that it has also done so under the auspices of Pembroke College of the University of Oxford. I can't think of more disparate entities, at least in their traditional and historical association and context, that would be united in such a forum, but I, like you, I am sure, am looking forward to what lies ahead. Thank you to Alexa, a doctoral candidate at Pembroke College who has spearheaded this project. Let's give her another hand. And you can read more about this initiative and about how you can contribute to the campaign in your programs that you have and by following the link that's included there. Each of our distinguished panelists represent a particular segment of Bermuda's race and resistance history starting from the early 1940s. Each presenter will follow the other in chronological order. They'll be reading either a passage or excerpts from their books that will give us some insight into that period of time and the issues experienced at hand. Each presentation will be 10 minutes, and I will remind them of their time at the 9-minute mark, which means they have 1 minute left. You, as the audience, will be given 2 minutes to ask a question pertaining to what you've heard or to make a statement in that regard. The panel will be given a maximum of 5 minutes to respond if needed. This way we can stay on track with our time and yet still allow for meaningful discourse. Follow-on questions, if you have them, or questions with part 2, 3, and 4 will be screened very carefully so that we can allow as many people as possible to participate. Is that okay? Okay. Finally, what is our wish for you at the end of tonight's discussion? We would wish that your viewpoints would have been articulated and discussed and reasonably and hopefully satisfactorily resolved, or at least responded to. We would hope that you go away richer in education and in information about this aspect of Bermuda's history. We would wish that you would help keep the discussion on the local radar, that the issues at hand that we'll be hearing about and discussing tonight won't be covered up or pushed under the carpet ever, but we'll also always keep it at the fore of local discussion. And finally, we wish that you would support our panel by their books, especially after hearing of the passages, and they'll be located, as you see, to my left, and I believe most of the books are available at Brown & Co. So now here we go for our first panelist, which is Mr. Walton Brown Jr. His book is Bermuda and the Struggle for Reform, Race, Politics, and Ideology, 1944 to 1998. Mr. Brown is a member of Parliament, Pembroke Central, and the Shadow Minister for Immigration and External Affairs. He's a radio host and journalist and former chairman of the Bermuda College Board of Governors. His book is a study of the quest for social reform in Bermuda. It starts with the Bermuda Workers Association, the first organization combining economic, social, and political struggles, and which sought to transform Bermuda for the betterment of its people. It ends with the 1998 election of the Progressive Labor Party, the party formed in 1963 to carry on with the agenda for social and political reform. His book reveals a number of themes: the insertion of race into the fabric of modern Bermuda, the successful use of ideology by the dominant elite to hold on to power, and the limited role played by the formal political process in effecting change. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Walton Brown Jr.
Good evening, everyone. I'm actually going to read from the first chapter in my book, and the section is called A Racially Structured Capitalism. Clearly, the point of departure for comprehending the relations between blacks and whites is the slave era. Bermuda slaveholders had very close contact with their slaves. They lived in the same area. They often worked alongside together. Unlike slave owners in Ireland's plantation slave economies. Out of this, Bermuda developed a highly paternalistic slave society that will continue to have some resonance in the post-slave era. American historian Eugene Genovese's magnum opus on slavery in the United States, Royal Jordan Road, offers us some insights, some very important insights, into the meaning of paternalism. Genovese begins by arguing that a particular form of paternalism developed in the Old South, one characterized most importantly by the centrality of class relations with racism as an important undercurrent. Paternalism, furthermore, has little to do with kind-heartedness or benevolence. And I quote from Genovese, paternalism grew out of the necessity to discipline and morally justify a system of exploitation. It did encourage kindness and affection, but it simultaneously encouraged cruelty and hatred. The racial distinction between master and slave heightened the tension already inherent in an unjust social order. End quote. In the Bermudian context, slavery can be seen primarily as an economic system designed to better exploit those workers who were enslaved. Paternalism mashed with racism, was the ideological apparatus that was implemented to justify the degradation of people of African descent. The effect that this system of paternalism had on blacks was considerable and long-lasting. Paternalism inhibited the creation of unity among the enslaved, either as blacks or as workers, because wherever paternalism exists, it undermines solidarity among the oppressed by linking them as individuals to their oppressors. This recognition of a powerful paternalistic structure, therefore, allows us to comprehend why so many of the slave conspiracies and the planned escapes came to nothing, primarily because one or more slaves informed their masters. And so despite the areas of cultural autonomy that slaves had managed to create for themselves in religion, in song, in dance, and in stories, the historical baggage left by paternalism has prevented slaves and the three generations after them from fully utilizing what individual strength they have generated. The intersection of paternalism with racism worked a catastrophe because it transformed elements of personal dependency into collective weakness. This collective weakness of blacks and workers meant the white ruling elite had almost a free hand in reorganizing society and emancipation to guarantee continued hegemony of the old dominant elite. On the political front, this was achieved by legislation designed to deny blacks the vote and to prevent them from being elected to parliament. Legislation came in the form of increasing the land qualification for voting. After August 1, 1834, to vote for a member of parliament, one had to earn property with a value assessed at no less than 100 pounds, instead of 40 pounds, as was previously the case. To run as a member of parliament, one had to earn property valued at 400 pounds instead of 200 pounds. The ruling class justified this by claiming that most blacks lacked sufficient education, were not suited for civic responsibility, and that to enfranchise them immediately would only create social disruption. The most appropriate course to take, they argued, was to gradually groom blacks until they had reached an acceptable level of political maturity. Only then could they be entrusted with the vote. The Colonial Office Undersecretary, James Stevens, explains, and I quote, "It seems to me that this is a grievance which time will redress, and that there may be a more general convenience and safety in allowing for the actual supremacy of the whites for a while, to the legal extinction of it, and to depart from it by degrees rather than to reach the same end by a more abrupt method. Allowing white supremacy for a while will continue unabated right into the second half of the next century. Only then will some dents be made in the armor of white elite rule." The political exclusion of blacks was supplemented by an equally conscious attempt to limit their influence through immigration and population policies. Once emancipation was imminent, white Bermudians began to argue that blacks should leave the island upon receiving their freedom. In a typical letter to the local daily, in a typical letter to the local daily, one writer recommended that blacks obtain a loan from the British government so that they might emigrate to Africa or elsewhere in the British Empire, so that, and I quote, because, and I quote, "there was little or no room for them here to exercise their talent and industry." When it became clear that blacks were not leaving, a bill was tabled in Parliament in 1842, and I quote, "to encourage immigrants coming to these islands from the United Kingdom." With this legislation, Bermuda's rulers had helped to shift the racial balance in favor of whites by persuading English men and women to settle in Bermuda. Efforts to limit the size of the black population are a recurring characteristic of racially structured Bermuda. When the state and local capitalists were forced to resort to labor from the West Indies during the construction of the dry docks at the turn of the 20th century and during the interwar period, the intention was always to persuade them to leave upon completion of their work, while whites were always encouraged to stay. During debates in the House of Assembly in 1921, for example, the sentiment among most politicians was that West Indians were generally undesirable. This elite group of almost all white men thought that some were good workers, that is to say, and I quote, knew their places in the home and were willing to do good, honest work. But the vast majority were simply, and I quote, troublemakers. They therefore continued to restrict West Indian immigration. In a Bermudanized version of the British colonial practice of divide and rule, Bermuda's ruling class engaged in a carefully orchestrated campaign to run a rift between black Bermudians and black West Indians. Much of this stems from the West Indian labor activity during the 1920s. The longshoremen, many of whom were West Indian, engaged in repeated struggles with the economic elite of the Great Depression, presenting the latter with the first inklings of organized resistance. One consequence was the state refusing to allow further West Indians onto the island. Another was to look for labor-saving technology. One company actually advertised that their products by saying, good labor is scarce, but good tools are not. In order to separate the comparatively docile Bermudian labor force from the West Indian counterparts, the former were told they were better than the hotheads and rabble-rousers from the islands, that they showed decorum and patience and would get further ahead by not stirring up trouble. Bermuda's workers listened, they listened attentively, but the continued success of this paternalism would further entrench black workers in mobilization for another 20 years. Workers' class and racial consciousness, which challenged elite rule, would only become politically salient in 1944 with the formation of the Bermuda Workers Association, led no less by a Trinidadian-born doctor. 100 years after emancipation, blacks had made no significant strides toward equality, constrained as they were by the racism that permeated civil society. Working in government departments such as the post office were still denied to blacks. Many retail stores hired only whites. There were separate schools for blacks and whites. Blacks were forced to sit at the back of the Anglican church and especially designated rows in the cinema. A number of restaurants refused to serve blacks, and hotels discriminated against blacks and Jews by asking travel agents to submit photographs and identify them with the name of a flower. By 1944, when workers first began to acquire consciousness of themselves as a class and went on to develop collective objectives, race consciousness had become an inextricable component of the more general class consciousness.
Our next panelist is Dr. Eva Hudson. She's the former president of the Bermuda Union of Teachers, the recipient of the Russell Award for contributing to world peace from the World Confederation of the Organization of the Teaching Profession. Dr. Hudson received her doctorate from Columbia University and is currently concerned with addressing the internalized racism of blacks in Bermuda through an organization which she founded called the National Association for Reconciliation, or the NAR. Her book, Second Class Citizens, First Class Men, is a discussion of the efforts and protests made by the colored MPs during the 50s and the challenge of the progressive group and CUAS during the early 60s. It particularly emphasizes W.L. Tucker, whose motion to extend the franchise proved the motivating factor for Roosevelt Brown to initiate the Committee for Universal Adult Suffrage, which led to our eventual achievement of universal franchise. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Eva Hudson.
This book was written in the 1960s, and when you read it, there'll become some expressions which will make it clear that it's a long time ago. Dr. Ken, Doc, as a successful physician, had all of those humanitarian qualities which are so important to Negroes. His flair for people and high society made him move easily in purely social gatherings, functions which have no other purpose save the enjoyment of one's fellows. He retained his popularity until his death. Mr. Tucker, or Bip, aloof, sincere, and very serious about life, developed a strong sense of duty in himself and looked for it in others. As a successful businessman, his qualities were not those of easy charm. Social gatherings for him were functions of one's social obligations. Doc seldom lost his patience. Bip was often impatient and often abrupt, and just as often repentant and quick to acknowledge his error. Strong and stubborn, he never hesitated to say, "I'm sorry." Those who knew him closely said, "Oh, he forgets." Perhaps he did, but he never forgot kindness. One of his most human qualities was his sense of gratitude. For years after, he would remember and talk about an act of kindness or thoughtfulness. And sometimes it seemed as if the more insignificant or casual the act, the greater the gratitude. At least some of Dr. Ken's success lay in his extreme self-confidence, which was almost a flamboyant egotism. He was always very sure about his ability and about the contribution which he could make and had made. Mr. Tucker retained a surprising humility, and any contribution which he did make, he quickly forgot. Dr. Ken compared his achievement, success, and influence to that of his fellow Negroes, and he knew that he was a giant. Mr. Tucker compared his to that of his white colleagues and knew that the result of all his efforts were circumscribed and limited by the prejudices of his island home. In the 1980s, there was a third edition, and in that edition I wrote, "Second-class citizens, first-class men, in describing the struggle of black politicians in the 1950s, also describes the struggles of the entire black community whom the black politicians believed that they had a responsibility to represent. Today, with our superficial integration, most black politicians are not generally perceived, nor do they regard themselves as representing the black community. Integration has brought the erosion of many significant, although once unidentified, values within the black community. Black women in particular have paid a very heavy price for this erosion. In the 1950s, in our segregated black community, black women were recognized as being important. In all racially segregated societies, the oppressiveness of racism is most destructive and soul-destroying for men. In Bermuda particularly, women were not only the backbone and strength of the black family, but they were the ones who became the teachers within the community and were respected as such. While sons were sent to work at an early age, black families often tried to protect their daughters from the most humiliating and degrading aspects of racism by trying to educate them. It was clearly a socially destructive agenda for the black community. a fact that continues to manifest itself in our prison population. Thus, black women did, and still do, play a significant role in the black community. In the 1950s, the contribution of black women was recognized and respected within the black community despite any latent sexism. Integration has made a significant difference for many black men who have been prepared to support the UBP. Part of the price of integration has been the emergence or intensification within the black community of male chauvinism and sexism, which seems so pervasive within the white community, and the consequent demeaning of black women, particularly of older black women. In Bermuda, this has led to new rhetoric and newly expressed concerns about the role of middle-class women, black and white. This has served to obscure and detract from the far greater problems of the majority of Bermuda's black, seasonally employed female wage earners. In the race to maintain a minimum standard of living and to accumulate consumer goods that they hoped would give them a sense of worth in the face of continuing social exclusion, blacks, particularly black women, have had less and less time for their families. Black politicians once tried to represent the black community. Today, with black politicians representing only their own interests, not just the black community, but the entire country has suffered. The church, which once played an important role in the social life of the black community, has become irrelevant to a younger generation tempted by government-approved Sunday marathons and other sports activities. This generation that believes that drugs can take the place of the church. An appreciation for education, home ownership, respect for older people, and a recognition of the contribution of black women were all values that once gave blacks a sense of community and self-worth despite their exclusion. In the 1980s, the black role models and decision makers demeaned those values as they became integrated and came to see material wealth and political power as the only socially rewarding goals to strive for. Social justice and genuine democracy were no longer goals after which to strive or for which to sacrifice. The future for the majority of black Bermudians today, in terms of quality of life and peace of mind, is far bleaker than it was in the 1950s. The upper strata of our society that controls both political and economic wealth, while largely in the hands of white Bermudians, is managed almost totally by strangers. Family life and positive social values, which once gave meaning to life, have been replaced by the race for elusive material wealth, which is always just beyond the grasp. An awakening on the part of the black community to the recognition that the need for struggle and sacrifice is greater today than it was in the 1950s might conceivably make some difference. But the real battle for a Bermudian identity and the possibility of Bermudian control over our lives and destinies is probably lost forever, irrespective of what ultimately happens in terms of the political independence from Great Britain, since the government already behaves as if Bermuda were an American territory, even though we are still a British colony. And it is obviously determined to continue to flood Bermuda with expatriates from every corner of the world.
David Critchley had a passionate commitment to social justice. The first Bermudian to earn a degree in social work, David was active in the desegregation movement in the late 40s and early 50s. playing a pivotal role in the clandestine printing of An Analysis of Bermuda's Social Problems, a treatise arguing for the dismantling of segregation. He left the island in 1953 believing race relations would never improve and not wanting to raise his children in a racist society, but was urged to come back in the early 70s by the late Gloria McPhee. He spearheaded the establishment of the Child Development Project and the formation of the Royal Commission on Alcohol and Drug Abuse. He also participated in many initiatives to improve race relations in Bermuda, including the anti-apartheid movement. His oldest daughter, Wendy Davis Johnson, will be reading from his book, Shackles of the Past.
I'm really honored to be here today to represent my father, David Critchley, and to join this distinguished panel. I hope you'll forgive me. I've just come from the funeral service of a really dear friend of mine, and actually Reed Kemp, some of you may know him, and so much of what was said about Reed resonated in what I'm about to say about my dad. So forgive me if I get a bit emotional here. Thank you, Alexa, for organizing this event, and I am so honored to join this distinguished panel. I wish I wasn't standing in here for my dad and that he could be here reading from his book. Last week, my family celebrated my mother's 90th birthday, and all of us at her party wished my father was still with us. He would have turned 90 in July. My brothers, my sister, and I know that if my father was still alive, he'd be fighting the good fight that was the focus of his life. There's no reason that we can think of for David Critchley to care so passionately about race relations. He came from a traditional white Bermudian family. It wasn't a particularly wealthy one, but he had all the privileges of being white in Bermuda, but he chose to buck the system. He graduated in 1948 from the University of Toronto with a degree in social work and spent the rest of his life trying to improve the way people relate to one another. My father believed that while human interaction is complicated, there were two specific areas that keep us divided in Bermuda. The first is that we let our perceptions of each other get in the way of really listening to and hearing each other. And that's what I heard in Reed's service, that he was a man who really listened and had such an impact because he didn't judge before he listened. So there's a lot of judgment in the way we interact, and that puts us in a divided position before we even begin a conversation. The second point that was a real focus of my dad's life is that our school system does not support children at risk. And generally, because we live in a predominantly black community, too many of these children were black. He felt this had serious, long-term repercussions for Bermuda that needed to be addressed systemically. Dad had some very specific recommendations about Bermuda's school system, but tonight I'm going to focus on some of his comments from his book, Shackles of the Past, about what he felt divided Bermuda in 1989. So this is just straight from one of his chapters. There's no question in my mind that black Bermudians have more than gone the second mile by accepting an outstretched hand when it was offered, whether from service clubs, churches, or other areas where the doors were closed or open according to skin color. It required trust, forgiveness, and often putting up with paternalism. Many black Bermudians have been criticized and even scorned for being so naive as to trust honkies or to compromise themselves for a piece of the action. I fervently hope that these same black Bermudians, as well as others, will recognize that the time for polarization on the basis of color has gone. Not too long ago, the major challenges in Bermuda were unquestionably related to segregation and discrimination. And it was a rare white Bermudian who even questioned the way it was, much less thought it should be otherwise. This is no longer true. We are now threatened by problems that do not respect Jim Crow and that will swamp us if black and white Bermudians are not able to rise above division on the basis of color. It would make little difference if every white person were to leave Bermuda tomorrow. the same challenge would remain, the challenge of how best and most equitably to distribute the economic pie, and the challenge of crime, mental illness, drugs, and other evidences of personal and social breakdown. We just can't afford to be divided and deterred by those who insist on getting their licks in for the sins of the past. Of course, the challenge to the white residents of this island is massive. So many of us don't seem to be able to get beyond throwing up our hands and raising our eyes to heaven and asking, what do they want now? I have no trouble in accepting that Black Bermudians are right when they say it has been a one-way street and the impetus for change has come from them. White Bermudians, with a few notable exceptions, have gotten by on Sir Henry Tucker's coattails and have basked in his reflective glory. They have gone along with integration reluctantly and with little conviction, and the extent of their commitment seldom has gone beyond being polite. However, I should say here that when I expressed this opinion to a white Bermudian, he was very indignant. With considerable feeling, he said, if anything it was the other way around. White Bermudians, he said, have done more than their part. In support of this, it was his and others' belief of many white people that in contrast to the old days, people are being appointed to positions because they're Black. Anyway, he concluded, there's just too damn much talk of color. Of course, for the purpose of what I'm saying in this chapter, whether the greater effort is being made by Black or white is not important. It is just another example of one of the many honestly held but unproven and irrelevant beliefs that divide us. It calls to mind the childhood argument, I did more than you did. The therapist, Dr. Albert Ellis, refers to it as ABC thinking, with A being an event or situation, B, what we tell ourselves about it, and C, our feelings or our opinions. Ellis suggests that much of what we tell ourselves, B, is negative or faulty and a cause of many of our difficulties. Thus, when we're sitting hot and tired on a bus after a hard day's work, someone steps on our foot. That's A. We start mumbling to ourselves, what a clumsy idiot he is. That's B, what we tell ourselves. We look up to admonish him to watch where he's putting his feet, C. Then we see the white cane he's holding, and we jump up to offer our seat, thinking, poor soul, why didn't someone help him? Anybody can see he's blind. Same person and same situation, A, but different message to ourselves, B, with the result that anger, C, is replaced by sympathy and concern, a new C. One reaction brings out irritation, the other evokes sympathy and concern. But to continue with examples of us and them thinking. And these are examples from 1989. The annual Barclay School Fair is an event that makes many Black Bermudians feel that integration is a one-way event. Few white people attend, thereby reducing its effectiveness as a fundraiser. Yet Black families account for much of the success of the Mount St. Agnes Fair. The virtual absence of white Bermudians at Cup Match is seen by many Black Bermudians as another example of white flight. Since Bermudians were well represented at Cup Match when I was young, I suspect other reasons may be responsible. I found it had lost its attraction for me when I returned to Bermuda in 1972 because the sound of boomboxes prevented me from hearing the bat hitting the ball, appeals for LBW, advice, jokes, and insults from spectators to players, and the occasional profanity that was much enjoyed by all. Of course, a less comforting explanation is that the absence of white people, except for tourists, is a reflection of the underground of suspicion and ill feeling that exists between Black and white. However, Black as well as white Bermudians have used similar reasons as mine to explain their dropping of Cup Match from their annual must-see list. But if this does at least partially explain the fall-off in white attendance, it is but another example of our tendency to polarize life in terms of Black and white. It is also an illustration of the lack of honest dialogue between Black and white Bermudians. We reach our conclusions about each other without first checking them out. It's that ABC thinking of work again.
Our next speaker is no stranger to any of us, Mr. Ottawell Simmons.
He is the author of Our Lady of Labor, speaking about and honoring Dr. Barbara Bowl. Ottawell Simmons was an elected member of Bermuda's House of Assembly for more than 30 years and a former president of the Bermuda Industrial Union. He's also served as the Caribbean representative for the Geneva-based union organizations, the International Federation of Woodworkers, the IFBWW, and the International Union of Food and Allied Workers Associations, the IUF. He had his early education in Bermuda and then attended the American Institute for Free Labor Development in Washington, D.C., and later Ruskin College in Oxford, England, where he majored in sociology. Adi is best known throughout Bermuda and the Caribbean for his organizing and negotiating skills and the numerous landmark successes he achieved during his leadership of Bermuda's working class. He was a close associate of Dr. Barbara Bowl for over 30 years, making him eminently qualified to provide this interesting account of Dr. Barbara Bowl. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ottawell Simmons.
Thank you, Evelyn. Good evening, sisters and brothers, ladies and gentlemen. I will be reading from Our Lady of Labor. This book is singularly about one lady, and that is the Lady of Labor, Dr. Bowl, and I'm going to give you a few things about her outside of just reading. Dr. Bowl was first of all somewhat like Wendy read about what her father was experiencing back during those old days. And Dr. Bowl was a member of the Bermuda Industrial Union in the 1960s. She took up membership. She was elected as General Secretary after, I may add, a lot of discussion among black people and leaders in the country. Nobody wanted a white leader at that time because, excuse this expression, but it's easier to understand than anything else, they couldn't be trusted to lead blacks. And that is the type of thing. So Dr. Bowl had to start from in the rear and work herself up to make friends with the other people like Adi Simmons, of course. And eventually, we saw that Dr. Bowl, first of all, had a massive intellect, a good intellect. She was a dedicated person. She was a Christian woman. She was not married, and we learned all about her, but she was prepared to go to the ring, in the ring, and fight any white system that existed at the time, and a big system was there in Bermuda in the 1960s. In 1960, Roosevelt Brown initiated the movement of the Committee for Universal Adult Suffrage, CUAS. The movement had as its main objective the enfranchisement of all people who reached the age of 21. At that time, a person could only vote if he or she owned a piece of land that was assessed, and Brownie, I say it, 60 pounds. I think you said 100 pounds. I say people 40 pounds. With and anyhow, that's it. This system militated against blacks having the right to vote, since the majority of blacks did not own land. It was on this issue that Dr. Ball made her public debut on a panel of prominent speakers in a series of meetings throughout the island. The speakers included Sir Henry Tucker, Robert Bobby Barrett, and I just want to go here. It's not in the book, but it's important. Bobby Barrett, who was a member of Parliament for a short period, he won a seat that Dr. Ball and Stanley Morton had, if you remember. And Bobby spoke at the Clay House Inn during one of these CUAS meetings. And Bobby was the most sincere and liberal white man that you could find at that time. Bear in mind, these books are not written in today's environment. These books were written when black people were very much a minority in power. And the thought of gaining power, it was just impossible back in the 60s. But before that, the story about Bobby Barrett. If you know him, he's the nicest guy you want to know, the nicest. He's a good artist, and he was like me, I guess, mediocre politician. But Bobby says, we've got to integrate. This was his speech at Clay House Inn, the old Clay House Inn. He says, we've got to integrate. He says, but I must admit, if I saw my daughter walking up the pathway coming home, and she was accompanied by a black man, I'm not so sure if I want to say I like that. And the house laughed at Bobby because they knew he was doing the best he can to make the point that even we, the most liberal white people, have problems with total integration. So that was Bobby. Other persons that were on those panels was Arnold Francis, John W. Swan, Mansfield Brock, and Walter N.H. Robinson. The group traveled throughout Bermuda, drawing large crowds on each occasion. Dr. Ball distinguished herself with her candid yet positive remarks. She spoke in favor of every citizen of Bermuda having the right to vote upon reaching the age of 21 and not having to own land. She dared to focus on the island's social and economic shortcomings, specifically highlighting the disparity of low wages paid to colored workers compared to white Bermudians, and she called for an equitable distribution of the wealth on this island. Dr. Ball asserted that Bermuda's claim to a vibrant economy was false because the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a white minority group of people, citizens. Up until this time, Dr. Ball's social interaction with blacks had been yet to be tested. She went to the girls' high school, which was segregated, and they never had a black student or teacher in that school during Dr. Ball's time. Her popularity with the black population grew in proportion to her increasing unpopularity with her white colleagues. Her speeches and her alignment with the, I knew this was going to happen, with the proponents of universal adult suffrage resulted in Dr. Ball being asked to discontinue her partnership with the Bermuda Medical Association. It was in such instances as these, many more of which would follow, that the venerable doctor sought strength, not already. Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, the period of 1960 was an interesting time for the Bermuda Industrial Union. There were no paid full-time officers, nor was there anyone with training or experience. And Dr. Ball came in at that time, and she spent some 2 years without pay working for an organization that was seen as a black organization. I just want to say that we have here in this book a photograph of some 25 people who attended a seminar back in the 1960s. And I will conclude, Madam Chair, by saying that Dr. Ball had faced the courts on more than one occasion, not for a crime that she committed, but for her leadership by a white woman for black people. The reader of this story is now witnessed, I say in the book, to the notable acts of service of Dr. Ball, Bermuda's Lady of Labor, and oh, what a lady she was. Thank you.